Good afternoon. My name is Michael Noonan. I am the Managing Director of the National Security Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. It's my great pleasure to be here today. Also, I'd like to thank Colonel Herbert and his staff here for the first-rate support that they are giving in partnership with FPRI. Our speaker this afternoon is Professor Carl Walling of the Strategy and Force Planning Department at Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Dr. Walling served in the U.S. Army as an interrogator with the 511th Military Intelligence Battalion in Nuremberg, Germany from 1976 to 1980. After that, he did his undergraduate work at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, and from there went on to do a joint PhD in political science and social thought from the University of Chicago. He's had many appointments before coming to Newport, to include at Carleton College, at Harvard University, the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado, and as a fellow at the Liberty Fund in Indianapolis. The author of several books, to include Republican Empire, Alexander Hamilton on War and Free Government, University of Kansas Press, 2000. A co-author of Strategic Logic and Political Rationality from Frank Cass in 2003. And he's currently working on a book, which is the subject of his talk here today, on the strategy and politics of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. Just note that the title of this talk has changed a little bit. It's now Thucydides on Strategy and Leadership. With that, Professor Walling.
Well, thank you, everyone, both from the 1st Division Memorial and from the Foreign Policy Research Institute for having me here. It's been splendidly organized, and I've learned a lot already. I'm going to break out of the mold a little bit. I'm going to pretend that everybody in this room is actually a high school student and that it's 2:30 in the afternoon. You've already had lunch. You're thinking about football practice or going home and watching the sitcoms or getting on the computer or whatever else it is you do. And it's going to be my job to keep you awake through the one of the latter periods of the day. Like you, I'm a classroom teacher. I feel most comfortable with a blackboard behind me. The closest thing I have to one here is a butcher block board. I could do this a la PowerPoint, but it will miss a dimension that I would like to throw into this. Namely, everybody in this room who actually knows something about Thucydides, we are going to fake a student conversation about the Sicilian expedition. And I'm going to try to lead the discussion. Now, why would I do anything so harebrained? It's because of the old saying that there's a difference between showing and telling. I could tell you a lot about how you might use Thucydides, or the question from Thucydides that I'm going to ask us to examine in the classroom, but it doesn't have the same punch as actually going through the process of examining that question as a group. And so, even though I don't study much pedagogy, I'm gambling that this would be more useful to you than me simply telling you what we could do. I also have to admit that I'm an imposter, a total fraud. By that I mean I've never studied military history formally, either as a high school student or a college student. In fact, I started out studying philosophy, but surprise, surprise, my mother was right. I couldn't get a job. And the War College is the only place that would take me. The real military historian in my family is my son, a real military history buff who happens to be here today and If you know anything about military history, you might talk to him a bit. All right. I, too, will make reference to the initial questions for this conference. And you should note, by the way, professors almost never do that. We go to conferences, the panels have titles which get you past committees that approve having the panel in the first place, and then you ignore the subject of the panel and present a paper on whatever you're working on so that you don't waste time on the panel. It would appear to me that that would be very disrespectful to you. I think I'll address the conference question. I'll give you another take on why we might study military history. It's based on one of my favorite books, Alexa de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And in the second volume of that book, Tocqueville makes a distinction between what he calls democratic and aristocratic historians, one which I think today could be expanded to a distinction between democratic and aristocratic social scientists. According to Tocqueville, in democracies, modern mass democracies, which are somewhat different from ancient democracies, in modern mass democracies, historians tend to explain events, how they began, how they unfolded, how they were concluded, to a large extent in terms of abstract forces beyond human control. Example, the society, the economy, stupid, globalization today. Huge things that seem to have us totally under their grip. And he asks, why do historians behave that way? It's kind of sociology of history, if you wish. And his answer is, this kind of explanation is most consistent with, and also most flattering to, the most fundamental principle of modern mass democracy, namely universal human equality. Indeed, much of what you might call the revenge against great men, the hostility to the great man theory of history, might actually result from certain ways in which people in democracy tend to think. As examples of democratic history, by the way, I would include both Karl Marx's understanding of history as determined by economic class struggle, where political forces on top, that's all superstructure, not really relevant. The serious stuff's the economy. Also, I'd include Tolstoy's War and Peace, which goes about debunking Napoleon. By the way, I'm going to make an aside. There was a question I wished to ask earlier, but I decided it wasn't my place to do so. It's about how one integrates the study not merely of history, but especially military history, with other liberal arts in such a way that military history can become one of the means by which you educate a full, developed, genuinely human being. Military history as a humanistic endeavor. And it occurs to me that your best allies in this struggle are in English departments. Why? Because think of the great literature of the West, especially. We could also do it in the East. I just don't know much about the East. Homer's Iliad. All right? Or when we get to Thucydides shortly, let's not forget that the great comedies and tragedies of Greece are all written in the shadow of the Peloponnesian War. And the Peloponnesian War cannot help lead people to ask the question, what is justice? Meaning that some of the great dialogues, the foundation of Western philosophy, is all occurring partly in reaction to what is going on there. To the extent one can integrate these things, I think you can make military history, which is already sexy to some kinds of people, sexier to a lot more. And I think that could be done at just about any period in history. For example, I love Aristophanes, great poet of satire. I think the best satire of the current war in Iraq is by the makers of South Park. It's called Team America, World Police. And if you have not seen it, you must. And to think about, if you think about it, to study war without a sense of its extraordinarily comic as well as tragic nature is really to miss the humanity of it all. Well, anyway, Tocqueville contrasts modern democratic historians and social scientists with what he calls aristocratic historians. And he does so in the context of explaining why in modern democracies it is extremely helpful to borrow from classical learning, to read the ancients, especially the ancient historians. His worry is that when we develop the habit, and that's what he's thinking about above all else, the habit of attributing causation to forces beyond human control, that this will lead to, this kind of determinism in social science will lead to fatalism among citizens and leaders. People who think, not like Sergeant Schultz, I know nothing, but rather, I can do nothing. Now, by the way, where I teach, the officers are meant to do the best they can under the circumstances they face. And the last thing you want is somebody in charge of your troops who says, I can do nothing. All right? You want somebody who says there's a range of possibilities out there by which I might achieve a better outcome. And that was the function of aristocratic and ancient learning in Tocqueville's Democracy in America. He's very much aware that modern democracy opens up a huge range of opportunities for people that they might never have had before. His worry, however, is that the habits of thinking in modern democracy might lead them to waste the freedom that they have, to not even know how much freedom they have. He's not saying that they have complete and absolute freedom, that human beings are gods. He knows that constraints exist, but he wants to expand the realm of freedom for citizens and leaders so that we can have control of the future of modern democracy, so far as that is possible. All right, that would be my argument for why one would study ancient aristocratic history. And here's the point. Most of ancient aristocratic history is military political history. All right. It's the history of commanders and statesmen. History told from the standpoint of the decision maker. If you want to correct the instincts of modern democracy, Tocqueville seems to be saying, balance the other way. The question is how to do it. And Professor Kagan already made a suggestion in that direction. By the way, what I just said is Tocqueville's explanation of Jeremy Black's point about the dangers of determinism. I now want to refer to another great book. I went to a great book school. I can't help talking this way. All right? I just can't help it. It's Clausewitz's On War. Now, it's an amazing book. One way of thinking about it is that Clausewitz is trying to do for war what Isaac Newton had done for physics. Indeed, a lot of the language in his book is drawn from physics. But every once in a while, reality hits him on the head and he says, wait a minute, there's a difference between war and physics. In physics, billiard balls collapse. You get an equal and opposite reaction. Says Clausewitz in war, animate force is directed against an animate force that reacts against you. And once you start using violence, it's very hard to keep it proportional. It's not equal and opposite. It's opposite and radically unequal. And so he's bringing in the realm of passion and explaining to you why war can never be a science, why it's always some form of art. And one of the passages that Professor Kagan referred you to discusses critical analysis. You should think about how Clausewitz defines that term, why he brings it up. He's talking to a whole bunch of officers who are veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. He's talking at the world's first war college, the Kriegsakademie in Prussia. And these folks have seen war. And the last thing they need is some fancy pants professor telling them what war is. They know it up front. They have experience And their experience, Clausewitz says, is what will blind them. It's their experience that will lead them to misunderstand things. Because it leads them to think like Henry Ford I, who told us that history is bunk. All right? History is bunk because the past is dead, and presumably meaningless and useless for those with a responsibility for doing something in the present with the hope of shaping the future. Clausewitz takes a different tack on this. He's explaining to these officers, these veterans, why they need to study military history. And he brings up this term, critical analysis. And he says it's not simply an examination of strategies actually chosen or of decisions actually made. That's the beginning point. It's the point that a conventional military historian would write about first. He says it's an examination of all possible strategies, of all possible decisions that could have been made. And why does he bring that up? Because you cannot praise a strategy even if it succeeds. You cannot praise a leader even if the leader is successful, says Clausewitz, unless you can show that what that leader chose was superior to the available alternatives. Perhaps there was another way to accomplish the objective at a lower cost or with less risk. Conversely, says Clausewitz, you cannot criticize or condemn a leader or a strategy even if it fails, unless you can show there were superior alternatives, unless you can show there were superior leaders. Why? Because sometimes we're dealt a rotten hand. Leadership and strategy in that circumstance is playing the cards you were dealt as best you could. So, Clausewitz says, we learn what happened as best we can. And then we start asking questions. And here's the hook for your students. You all know it. When they're really sucked into the subject, when they're really grooving on what's going on in class, they ask you, what if? They ask you, what if? Now, what if General Lee had not gone to Gettysburg? What if Napoleon had not gone to Moscow? What if Napoleon had managed to cross the Channel and invade England? How might history have been different? Now, I know there are many professional historians who look down their noses at alternative history. It sounds like science fiction. What it is it's a thought experiment. And it's a thought experiment designed to discipline the mind to do two things. First, to search for all the available options to solve a particular decision maker's problems. What are the options? And second, to figure out which option is best. One part works on the imagination, the other part teaches rigor. That is to say, Clausewitz is saying, don't give me unrealistic options like, what if Napoleon had B-52 bombers? All right? That ain't going to go. All right? What if, we had those beams that transferred us up into ships in Star Trek? No. He's talking about realistic options. And then you start evaluating them in terms of their cost, their risk, how likely they are to achieve your objectives. And if you do this over and over and over again, says Clausewitz, on different historical case studies, you will discipline your mind to be free in the sense of searching for options and to have good judgment about which is best. All right, now I'm going to bring in an argument. I think, you see, I don't want to be preaching to the converted here. I hope this ain't a church. But if you're trying to teach military history in a high school, you have to ask yourself, who could be my allies? Who's going to help me here? Who's going to give me permission? And if you say, I want to teach it because I'm fascinated by it, I love it, that's not an argument. because somebody else is fascinated by something else and might love it just as much. From that standpoint of view, your passions are equal. And why budget any more time for you than someone else? Maybe try something different. That the survival of democracy depends upon educated citizens and leaders. What would those people be? People who can understand the range of options for the problems they face and have trained their minds to seek out the best. All right? This is civics of a sort, not patriotic in the sense of passion, but rather enlightened citizenship, enlightened leadership. That strikes me as a more powerful argument that I want to study military history because I love it. All right, now the next question I would have you address is how would you go about teaching what Clausewitz calls critical analysis? Huge caveat to everything I say here. I chose to talk about the Sicilian expedition in Thucydides, even though many of you may know nothing about it, and that's fine. Because I know something about it, and because I figured a few people here would know something about it, and I'd get allies in this endeavor. I just hope they're not French. The question I'm going to ask us to play on is a classic example of critical analysis. It occurs over and over again in history. And so you should pay less attention to the example than the question and some of the tactics or strategies for getting people to think about it carefully. The question is, when countries find themselves in quagmires, where the use of force has put them in a position where they have no clear way to go forward or backward, does that result from the poor execution of a sound strategy or from a really dumb strategy in the first place? If it's poor execution, then you wind up criticizing the commanders who executed it. If, however, it's a really dumb strategy, then you have to wind up criticizing the higher-ups who set the political goals and set the strategy. And by the way, get this. The worse the strategy, the worse the odds for good execution. Why? Because poor strategy puts poor soldiers in a situation where it's very difficult to execute. I'll give you examples of where this occurs. Lee at Gettysburg. Should he have been there in the first place? Or was it, Jeb Stuart was off on his ride? The Schlieffen Plan prior to World War I. Was this a crazy idea because it provoked the war against a tight coalition that the Germans were trying to avoid in the first place? Or was it because the field commander weakened the right wing and prevented the Germans from enveloping Paris? Or the British expedition to the Dardanelles in World War I. Was that a crazy idea because there was not much chance that Russia would be kept in the war even if you supplied it? Or was it poor execution on the part of timid commanders? Do we blame Churchill for coming up with this crazy idea, or do we blame those commanders? I would suggest it applies also to the Vietnam War. Did Americans just really screw up in theater, applying conventional strategies to what was an insurgency? Or was there something crazy about going to Vietnam in the first place? And obviously, you could ask this same question about the war in Iraq. And how you answer that question will have important outcomes for the present. There's a wonderful scene in the film Patton where he's visiting some monument in Tunisia. And he talks about how he's lived there before. And people think this is because Patton's got some crazy idea about reincarnation. I don't think that's it. I think I understand Patton. He has lived there because the same problems keep coming up again and again and again. Now, the details will change, but the same sorts of problems. We got in this quagmire. Was it because of poor strategy or poor execution? If it's poor execution, then maybe there's still chance. Maybe there's still hope for the strategy to succeed. But if that strategy was screwed up from the beginning, there's an argument for cutting your losses and getting out. Now, I'm not going to take a stance on this big question, especially as it relates to current events. But I do wish to point out to you that this study of the past, this classic question, and application of critical analysis to it, is a great tool for getting students with imagination and curiosity to begin to practice some intellectual discipline. All right, I'm going to apply this now to the case of the Athenian expedition to Sicily. Quick summary. This war between Athens, the leader of the Delian League, and Sparta, the leader of the Peloponnesian League, arose, says Thucydides, because of Sparta's fear of the growing power of Athens. So Sparta launches a preventive war to take down Athens before it becomes too dangerous to deal with. The war becomes protracted, lasts 27 years in total, in large part for two reasons. There are others, but these two will do for right now. First, the stakes are so high for both sides that they can't afford to give up. And second, because of the radical asymmetry of the conflict. Athens is a naval power, Sparta is a land power. Neither has a way of getting at the other directly. And when that, it's classic conflict between the whale and an elephant. You ever thought about that? How does a whale fight an elephant? Or if you wish, a tiger fight a shark. They live in different elements, and that's why these wars frequently last so long. There's some indirect strategies in the war. You get a peace that Thucydides calls no more than a truce. After all, the largest land battle of the war was fought during the so-called peace. And in the 17th year of the war, the Athenians, and by the way, there's maps in there, in my handout, the Athenians decide that they're going to go conquer Sicily. Our question is, since the Athenians will be destroyed in Sicily, all right, suffer a defeat in Sicily far worse than the one we suffered in Vietnam, was this a really dumb idea, or did the failure result from poor execution? Now, I want you to understand, so much, of our art as teachers, is sucking those kids in. My view is I like them to go out and take an extreme position so that I can saw off the limb that they climbed out on. All right? You start with that question, I guarantee you that the first 10, 15 minutes, they'll talk about the strategy and the execution without ever asking themselves a simple question. What on earth were the Athenians trying to achieve? Very crucial here. Strategy's a means to an end. All right? It's a means. You can't talk about the value of the means without thinking a little bit about the ends, about the objective. So, all you Thucydides honchos in the room, I'm going to need your help. I have a few ideas of my own, by the way. Let's suppose this class had divided up into teams. They had read the great debates in Athens prior to this war. Athens, a democracy. There's debates going on. Some people say, let's go! And others saying, this is crazy. In order to evaluate whether you go, you've got to figure out what it is you're trying to accomplish. Now, some would say that the Athenian goals were totally clear and completely rational. Others would say they were totally unclear and irrational. Now, note the impact on strategy. If you're on this side of the column, the odds that you're going to side with bad strategy are going to go way up. If you're on this side of the column, you might say something about execution. Common argument. You're free to raise your hands now, all you Thucydides folks, okay? You don't have to turn that thing up. I'll recognize you. Help me out. Clear and rational, unclear and irrational. Go.
I'm Ben King, Licking Valley High School in Central Ohio. I remember one passage vividly in which Thucydides says that the average Athenian was really into the idea of going there. They were drawing maps in the sand and thought it would be a cakewalk.
He says they had neurotic longing. They fell in love with it. All right? And it was a love that came straight from the groin. All right. That suggests passion, rational. What do you think? I'll put it here. Passion, and a particular one, eros. And Angelo, I'll get right to you. I want to talk about the particular form of eros that he's thinking of. For the Greeks, eros refers to desire in general, bodily desire especially. But what he's talking about especially is money, greed. The Athenians have a military-industrial complex. The poor people in the city live in the port part, the Piraeus. The only way they make a living is when their fleet is rowing. Sicily's a long way away from Athens, and they're dreaming of what Thucydides calls immortal pay, everlasting pay. All right? The world's best 401k plan from rowing back and forth between Athens and Sicily. So there's this huge amount of eros and greed as one motive. But what we're going to discover is there's a whole lot of motives going on here. And this isn't a sufficient answer. Professor Codevilla.
That remark of Thucydides comes later, after the decision has been made. When the decision is made, it is made on the basis of Alcibiades' speech, and Alcibiades' speech does not talk about that. It talks about the necessity to keep on moving, and it does not talk about any specific goal. It is something about it is something akin to Mussolini's remark that he who stops is lost.
Expand or die?
Expand or die, but there's another thing also, that the opposition that you put between bad strategy and bad execution is not a good one. You had both bad strategy and bad execution in this case.
Look, the students aren't supposed to realize that until the end of the class.
Okay.
You're spoiling my party here. There's an argument that you have to expand or die. Let me fill in some detail on why Alcibiades might have thought that. You got two great leaders in Athens leading the debate here. Alcibiades, who's an expansionist and wants to go to Sicily. Nicias, who's something of a dove and is worried about the home front and homeland security. In a previous part of the book, the Melian dialogue, the Athenians make an argument that the existence of any independent islander is a danger to their empire. Because while everybody knows that Athens isn't much good on land, the mere fact that an island could be independent of their empire suggests that others might be independent, and therefore the safety of their empire requires subduing all independent islands, which would lead you to Sicily, and in principle, a lot further, right? The Mediterranean would have to be dominated by Athens, all right? So that's one argument. By the way, note, what we do here in class, we know it. If we use a chalkboard, we know that if we put the students' remarks up there, it's sidewalk art. So, I might not stick to my outline here. This might be better than my outline. I might have to go home and rewrite it. All right, give me another argument about goals. What about grain? Anybody heard the old grain argument? Dex? Professor Wilson.
The grain stock from the Ukraine is vulnerable, as proven by the loss of Amphipolis, so they get a redundant grain supply by going to Sicily.
All right. This is in the background of the entire war. Amazingly, Thucydides himself does not talk a whole lot about this issue. But it is in the background. You'll always find it in the editor's introduction. And if a student brings it up, that means he's read the introduction, not the book. Give him a B. All right? What you got to think about here is there are three major sources of grain in the Mediterranean world: Egypt, the Ukraine, has to go through the Bosphorus, and Sicily. Athens does not make enough food to feed itself. It's worried that any moment the Persian Empire might shut down the Bosphorus. The Persians usually control Egypt, except when Egypt's rebelling. And they need an alternative source of supply. There's a second dimension to this, though, Dex. The Athenians sent not one, but 3 expeditions to Sicily. The first 2 don't pan out. But in the second one of the arguments for going is that the major city in Sicily, Syracuse, is a colony of Sparta's primary ally, Corinth. And Corinth can't feed itself either. The Athenians throughout the war are trying to break up the Spartans' alliance system, which means putting pressure on Corinth. If you can control the grain out of Sicily, the argument goes, you can maybe starve Corinth enough that it will say bye-bye Sparta. And if you do that, you achieve one of the primary objectives of the Athenians from the beginning of the war. So grain's part of the story. Any other possibilities here? Yes, sir.
One other crucial one, which is the Syracusans are Dorians, and the Athenian fear is that they're going to show up when the Spartans again show up in Attica.
All right.
And that you will face an alliance between Sparta and Syracuse against Athens.
This is the old peer competitor argument. It works something like this. There's some ethnic divisions in Greece. Spartans, Corinthians, Syracusans are Dorians, Athenians are Ionians. The argument here would be that Syracuse, if it emerges as top dog in Sicily and controls its resources out of kinship and love of its fellow Dorians in the Peloponnese, will obviously develop a fleet that will enable them to fight the Athenians at sea. Now, I'm being mean, and it's only because we got limited time. All right? I'm being petty. Put up with me. I'm making fun of the peer competitor argument. Why? Because this war arises in part because of a quarrel between a colony of Corinth and Corinth. Corcyra and Corinth. And Corcyra was definitely not a loyal ally of its mother city. In general, I don't think ethnic loyalty counts for much in this book. At the beginning of the war, the Spartans say to the Sicilians and the Italians, we need a 500-ship navy. We only got 100 in our alliance. Hey, you guys, give us 400 ships. You know what they say in Sicily and Italy? Mañana. All right? They don't send anything. The only time the Sicilians get involved in this war, navally, is after the Athenians invade them. That suggests to me that the peer competitor argument, I'm going to say, summarize, doesn't stand up. All right, I'm being unfair. It's because we got limited time. You folks, golly gee, you could do 5 or 6 seminars on this. I only got 40 minutes. Or actually, I got 75, right?
Yeah.
How many more do I got?
Well, you have a half hour left in the session since the questions are already...
Good. All right. Let's think of a couple other motives. One more, and we can move on. Give me a rational one or an irrational one. Professor Kagan, you're being so quiet.
Now, Professor Walling, the reason I'm being so quiet is that I'm not really sure that we can separate our goals into 2 categories, clear and rational and irrational. It seems to me that one can say that there is a reason why fearing a greater power or fearing the acquisition of land or weapons by an enemy, or indeed seeking advantage in war is perhaps rational, perhaps irrational, and I don't know that I would make the division that you are.
Now, no. This is the problem when you invite professors to high school seminars. They keep coming up with these A-plus answers that the students are supposed to write. Can we simply, in order to move on, without settling this issue? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether you settle the issue. All right? Who cares in the final analysis? If the students have said, before we go to war, we should try to be as clear as we can about what it is we're trying to accomplish and whether reasonable people would go along with it. So long as we have that and recognize that when you go to war, you usually do so for mixed motives. It's always some mixture of irrational and irrational. It's fine. All right. Provisional. Mixed. Let me come back to the point I said about this question, though. This question works on 20,000 other cases. All right? You can do it with the Schlieffen Plan. You can do it with Churchill and the Dardanelles. You can do it with Vietnam. You can do it with us in Iraq. And that's the point of it all, to give them the tools to do it well. And by the way, they're not dumb. Well, some of them are. But most of them aren't dumb. They'll start making the analogies themselves. All right? And then all you got to do is calm them down and make sure they're fair and reasonable ones. All right. Are you folks going to say my dichotomy up here is too simplistic? Strategy, good, bad? Start with the black and white and let the smart students figure out the nuances. All right. Why might someone say, this is a good strategy, going to Sicily? After all, the primary threat's there in central Greece. It brings me back to the 2004 election. One of the candidates accused the other of dropping the ball. The main war was somewhere else, and how'd we get where we got? All right? My question. If the main war or the main conflict's in one place, why are you going someplace totally different? Sir.
A reason it might be considered a good strategy is it plays to the sort of strengths of Athens. That is, you have a naval power attacking an island.
Okay.
Also, if you were Captain Littleheart, you might say this is the indirect approach, hitting them from the side, not directly head-on, because if you go head-on land power against the land power, you're going to lose. So you play to your strengths, try to hit them where they're weaker. That is, by using your naval strength to hit them on the side.
You're going to pitch your strength against your enemy's weaknesses.
To the left flank.
Left flank. Fair enough. Indirection. Let's think that through for a second. The way it gets expressed in the debates in Athens by the chief proponent of the expedition, Alcibiades, is Sicily today. Italy tomorrow, Carthage later. He repeats that argument in Sparta, though we're not sure whether we really believe him there. But it looks to me like Alcibiades is saying we're going to gobble up a whole bunch of stuff out there and get really rich and find a whole bunch of allies who will give us ground troops, which we desperately need to take on the Spartans. So we're going to go the long way around, employing our navy to achieve the objective of finally defeating Sparta. Okay. Critical analysis. Oh, we got to do this. Can everybody can see there's some plausibility in this argument? The indirect argument? Let's try this. Remember what I said about critical analysis? You have to look at the alternatives. All right, that's really crucial. Students have to start thinking about the alternatives. Any place else the Athenians might go besides Sicily? Sir?
Well, there's another possibility in that at this point, I believe they'd reached a sort of a standoff with the Spartans, and this would have been a good time to try to come to peace. The Spartans at this point were open to settling the whole issue.
All we are saying
exactly. This was a possibility
is
for them.
give peace a chance. That's Nicias's argument.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's up there with John Lennon. Imagine. Technically, at the start of this expedition, the sides are at peace. All right? It's very unstable. Thucydides is right to call it a truce. One option is see whether you can make peace work. All right? Make the peace work better. Any other options? Excuse me? I heard something.
You can blockade Corinth. You can strengthen Pylos. I.e., you can follow the Periclean strategy.
All right. Blockade Corinth, Pylos. I'm going to throw in a couple others, and I'll try to explain each of them a little bit.
Megara, of course, Megara.
Look, you can make the peace work. You could blockade Corinth. It's difficult to sustain logistically, but not impossible. All right? And you've got to remember, going to Sicily is going to cost the Athenians a lot. And if you're going to spend the money to go out there, why not spend the money to go there? Pylos. Sparta consists of 90% slaves. A defeated ethnic group, the Messenians, who really, they're called the Helots, they really hate the Spartans. The Athenians figure out a way to establish a fort at a place called Pylos that serves as a sanctuary for the slaves to retreat so that they can initiate a guerrilla warfare against the Spartans. That and a couple other things help bring the Spartans to the peace table. A case could be made that if you're going to start up this war again, why not success? Why one Pylos? Why not 2, 5, 10, 20 sanctuaries all along the coast to support the guerrillas? Think about what's going to happen to Sparta that has a conventional army if it has to deal with this kind of massive insurgency. By the way, this one's cheap. Right? This one's really cheap. Megara, the boardwalk of the Peloponnese. We forget, there's not one but 2 Peloponnesian wars. One happened earlier, concluded. At the beginning of the First Peloponnesian War, Megara was an ally of Athens. It sits across the isthmus between Attica and the Peloponnese. If Athens controls it, and Athens built walls for it down to the sea so it can feed itself, it has reasonably good terrain for defense, it can block the passage of the Peloponnesians into Attica, thereby protect its farms and fields, feed itself better, avoid the mass panic and hysteria of thousands of refugees crowded in the city. And by the way, divide Sparta from its primary ally on land, which is Thebes. The Athenians come within a hair's breadth of taking this boardwalk in the 8th year of the war. Hey, and by the way, they got control of its ports. Hey, maybe there's an argument for trying this again. Another possibility is an alliance with Argos, Sparta's traditional enemy, second largest land power in the Peloponnese. The Athenians try on a number of occasions to link up with Argos. The case could be made that had they executed better, they might have defeated Sparta on land. See, this looks really attractive right now. You link it to the grain, to preventive war. Looks really cool in theory. Somebody at a think tank at AEI must have designed it. Or somebody at the Kennedy School. I don't know. But you can't really evaluate it. This is the point to drive home to the students. You can't do it in isolation. You've got to look at the other side. How else might we have accomplished our goals? Could we have done it at less cost and less risk? All right, I'm not going to settle this quarrel. Hey, the point isn't to settle the quarrel. It's to start a rumble. Execution. Let me point out some problems for the Athenians. I got 10 minutes?
20.
Excuse me? 5?
20.
I got 20. Oh, cool. See, I'm always running out of time. That bell, I hate that bell. The execution of this thing. You're going to need a little bit of background. On the eve of the expedition, the Athenians appoint 3 commanders for it, which to moderns really looks odd. Why 3 commanders? Seems to violate what the military would call the principle of unity of command. And even if we agree that a group is better at making a decision about going to war, many of us can see why when you're in the poop, as they say, you need one guy in charge. All right? You need one person in charge. Why are the Athenians doing anything like this? Best answer I can come up with is they don't trust each other. They're attracted to the plan developed by Alcibiades. But Alcibiades is something of a glory hound. And beyond that, he's something... he's definitely not PC. The best thing... I'm just going to call him the Elvis Presley of the Mediterranean world. All right? Because he's wild. He thinks from the hip, okay? He thinks from the hip. Now, the other commander they send along with him is a guy named Nicias, who's known for his ostentatious piety. All right? Alcibiades is smart. All right? He's daring. He's brilliant. But the Athenians are worried he's such a glory hound. He's so driven by passion. His arguments for tyrannizing abroad, maybe somebody might try to apply that at home. And if you picked anybody in Athens likely to pull it off, it might have been Alcibiades. Let's check him. Let's send somebody we can trust. Let's send old Nicias, who's the leader of the Athenian version of the moral majority. The Athenians are sending Jerry Falwell to babysit Elvis. You're going to think about this. All right. What a crazy idea. They also send a third commander, a guy named Lamachus. And each of these guys has a different idea. By the way, the Athenian orders... This is why I think the clarity and rationality is important. The Athenian orders say, when you get to Sicily, do whatever's good for Athens. How's that for a clear mission statement? Do whatever's good for your country. So they divide the command amongst these guys. Each of them has different goals and different strategies. What's the result? Total incoherence, delay and indecision. Everybody in Sicily knows... 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. The Athenians are coming. All right? The Athenians are coming. They lose the advantages of surprise. But because of factional quarrels at home, all right, the influence of domestic politics on strategy, they felt they had no alternative. All right. What are the 3 options when they get there? Lamachus comes up with a strategy that's usually favored by the military historians. Go straight to the major city in Sicily, a place called Syracuse, shock and awe them, win a quick battle, knock out Syracuse, and the rest of the house of cards should come falling down. Alcibiades, perhaps repeating some stratagems he'd used earlier in other campaigns, says, no. What we need to do is get there. The cities of Sicily are as divided as the cities of Greece. We'll show up. We'll have a big force. We'll say, you're with us or against us. They'll bandwagon with us. We'll gather allies and we'll slowly move on Syracuse. There's an irony here. They wind up sending a force substantially larger than the one Alcibiades recommended. So big that instead of shocking and awing the Sicilians, whenever they show up, people shut the gates. They're so scared. So it becomes counterproductive, produces the opposite of the desired result. And Nicias thinks it's a really rotten idea from the beginning. the dumbest strategy he's ever heard of. And he says, let's sail around the island and go home, or close to it. Let's show the flag and get out of there before bad things happen to us. All right. Things fall apart rapidly in Sicily. The question is why? Did the Athenians do as well as circumstances allowed? I.e., was it just bad luck? Or was there something in the way they did things that was really rotten? The more you emphasize the poor execution, the more you can redeem the strategy, with the caveat that bad strategy tends to lead in the direction of poor execution. What do you think? Sir?
It seems very much to me like what they've done is, in a chess game, you have players, and I played my students a lot, and they fall into this trap all the time, who start focusing on killing my pieces instead of winning the game. And it seems to me that Alcibiades has begun focusing on killing pieces instead of winning the game.
Where I work, we call that the tactization of strategy. All right? Where, well, what you just said, you go after units rather than after decisive victory. I'm not sure that's true of Alcibiades. A critic of him might say that. It seems to me he knows what he wants. Not only does he have an indirect strategy for going after Sparta after gobbling up half the Western Mediterranean, he's got an indirect strategy for going after Syracuse. You can't left flank them all the time, all right? Sometimes, hey diddle diddle, straight up the middle, all right? Sometimes the frontal approach, the direct approach, might be better. I buy that. Maybe it's just too smart by half, over-sophisticated. Because the more sophisticated the plan, the more parts in it can go wrong. By the way, that's an argument for poor strategy on my part. It depends on too many ifs following into place. Axiom of military, keep it simple, stupid. KISS. All right? Alcibiades' route is very complex. The advantage of Lamachus is it's straight and direct. But they don't follow Lamachus. They follow Alcibiades, who has a kind of compromise plan between that of Nicias and Lamachus. All right, so I think you're over here as saying too complicated. But that's really more of a critique of the strategy, I think, than the execution. Anything else? Professor Codevilla.
Nicias queered, if you'll excuse the term, the execution at the outset by not mentioning, by failing to mention something which he as a general knew was absolutely necessary, namely cavalry. And that when the battle is finally joined under the walls of Syracuse, the Athenian infantry wins but cannot follow up because of the lack of cavalry. This is something which was entirely foreseeable and was foreseen because, as I say, you must assume that Nicias was a competent general. He has shown himself competent in the past. He certainly knew that he would need cavalry. They did not bring cavalry, and indeed the very first thing they did after that battle was to send for cavalry. So
yeah, though it takes 6 months to a year.
Anytime you ask for reinforcements, it is because you made a mistake in the first place in sizing your force.
I buy that. For me, the question is, what category does it belong to, or does it belong to neither?
Who cares?
Excuse me?
Who cares?
Well, I want to keep it as tidy as possible because I'm not giving them PhDs. And I want them to really think through the categories too. I would argue that this one's tricky. Since they lack cavalry when they get there, what they do, hunker down after the initial victory and wait for more cavalry, is probably as good as circumstances would allow, some would say, and that's an argument for Nicias doing the right thing. I would raise this question, though, and it goes back to strategy. Nicias knew they needed the cav. He didn't ask for enough of it. I raise a bigger question. How are you going to get all those horses to Sicily? Here, logistics does matter. These are open boats. All right, they tip, and you're taking the long way around in very dangerous seas. The best way for them to get cavalry is in Sicily.
And then you don't do it. If you can't do it right, you don't do it.
Oh, so you mean it was a rotten strategy?
Both.
Why are you being so stubborn?
Because I'm right.
Sir, go ahead.
I would say that the three commanders and the cavalry decision are part of a larger problem, which is lack of commitment. They're going on a major offensive endeavor, and they're not committed to it. And so I would guess that's a strategic problem.
Well, it depends on how you define commitment. I mean, their passions they're very much behind it passionately.
Nicias is not behind it.
Excuse me?
Nicias is not behind
Nicias
it.
is
Probably
not behind
not,
it.
maybe not half, but maybe 40% of the people who voted are not behind it.
All
And
right,
the fact that they don't bring what they need shows that people are actively not being committed.
All right, I buy that. By the way, we should note part of the execution drama here is once they get to Sicily, some bad luck happens for the expedition. Alcibiades has enemies in Athens. All right? The Jerry Falwell faction is out to get Alcibiades, says Thucydides. There's a culture war going on there. And they arrange for his recall on charges of impiety, which is a capital offense in Athens. They'd kill him if he's convicted. By the way, note this. His enemies waited until he and the army were out of town because his closest followers were in the army and the navy. And so they figured if those guys are out of town, they won't vote to acquit Alcibiades. He'll have no friends in court, and they can kill him that way when he comes back. By the way, this is a problem. If on the eve of the expedition, factions in Athens are trying to get at least one of the generals killed, and I always ask when Thucydides said, Alcibiades' enemies were trying to get him killed, which enemies was Thucydides thinking about? All right, lots. They might even have included Nicias. Can't be certain. All right? If the generals hate each other that much, and you've divided command amongst them, the odds of good execution, of getting any decision while you have two or three of them in the same place, are going to go way down. They sort of go along with Alcibiades, but Alcibiades gets recalled. As the elder general, Nicias becomes primus inter pares. They get to Sicily, but Lamachus is killed in battle. Now, the general whose heart was never in the expedition in the first place, partly because he was stupid. Oh, and by the way, Professor Kagan, I wanted to bring up this other side of Thucydides. Because I didn't meet him in a history department. I met him in a philosophy department. There is a certain amount of evidence that Nicias thinks this expedition is unjust because, in the end, it's nothing more than what St. Augustine called such things in ancient history, a giant pirate raid. All right? They're after booty. The Greeks have been after booty since the Trojan War. They're going to Sicily for a booty, and it ain't Helen's. All right? It's linked to this talk about Eros. When you think about that, a man like Nicias, he may be Jerry Falwell-like, and you might not like Jerry, but Nicias has a conscience. All right? He's a decent man. That's part of the pity of the way he will eventually die. By the way, decent does not necessarily mean smart. All right? And that's part of the ambiguity of the way of Thucydides' praise of the man. But he's got scruples here from the beginning. Later on in the expedition, when things start to go really south, he starts looking at their failures as punishment from the gods. Now that's linked back to what we said about determinism. In modern times, we say the society or globalization or the economy. For the Greeks, when they start to get fatalistic, lose the initiative, can't make a decision, they say, we offended the gods. The gods are out to get us. So what we watch here is Nicias having a slow nervous breakdown. He's very indecisive. I want to stress this. He has a number of chances to win, or at least achieve a much better outcome, even without cavalry. For example, Spartan and Corinthian reinforcements come to Syracuse. Anybody notice that Sicily's an island? And that Athens has the biggest navy in the Mediterranean? There is a solution to this problem. Nicias gets intel that reinforcements are coming. Squash them, kill them, stomp on them. All right? Don't let them get there. But Nicias sort of downplays it, doesn't pay much attention to it. He's absorbed in the details of building walls around Syracuse. Because in ancient Greek warfare, the way you won a siege was to build a wall around it, starve the people into surrender. Anything else we want to say about Nicias?
Moral coward.
You say moral. Okay, go ahead, Michael.
And political coward. He was afraid of what the Athenian people would say about his failure.
You're referring to the letter he writes to the Athenians, in which he says, either give me orders to withdraw or send reinforcements equal to the size of the original expedition. That is, double or nothing. That's what he's saying to them. Double or nothing. Nicias appears to be ill with some kidney disease. We do not know for sure whether he actually was ill. But Nicias is clearly playing on the sympathy of the Athenians because he's lost the initiative, lost control of the battle. He's putting the blame on circumstances that he says are beyond my control. The Spartans showed up. I couldn't help it. Yes, you could. The Corinthians got here. Couldn't do it. Yes, you could. I don't have any cavalry. Why don't you go get some? Now, it's like little kids, you know. I used to love it. My son's here. I won't blame it on him. I'll blame it on my daughter. You know, you'd go into a kitchen. You'd find a broken glass on the floor. And you'd say, what happened? Child responds, it dropped. What do you mean, it dropped? You dropped it. All right? Total evasion of responsibility. Now, there's a comedy to Thucydides. There's tragedy in his story. And I got to stress this. Your best allies are in English departments. If you can tell them there's comedy and tragedy in this book, all right, it'll really help you out. What's the comedy? Nicias is gambling, as he had gambled earlier, that if he tells the Athenians to double their bet, they will say, this costs too much. And like rational people will say, well, it's time to cut our losses. Why don't you come back home? They don't do it. They say, well, double or nothing? Double. All right. Now you got, 50% of the Athenian army and navy off there in Sicily with a commander who has lost the will, the initiative, the imagination, the sense of responsibility to do anything with it. This, I believe, was your point, more or less? All right. You can still say disaster did not have to come. One of my favorite general in the Peloponnesian War is a guy named Demosthenes, for whom Cleon stole all the credit, and it's not fair. All right. You should have been allowed to sue for copyright on plans in this book. But, Cleon, he's a plagiarist and takes it all from Demosthenes. Anyway, Demosthenes is an amazing, adaptive, and imaginative general who arrives, assesses the situation, and says, Nick, we got a choice. We either get out of Dodge as soon as possible, or we bet it all on one quick campaign. If we don't achieve our objective, we're going to get on our ships and get out of here. By the way, we don't have to go all the way back home. We can go anywhere we want in Sicily. And we can still raise havoc, still accomplish something. By the way, Demosthenes had failed in some earlier campaigns and gotten a number of Athenians killed. He refused to come home until he got some battlefield victories. Why? because of the deploring state of Athenian civil-military relations. The Athenians had a habit of executing or banishing generals who failed in battle. And therefore, you can understand why Nicias was a little afraid to tell the truth to the Athenians. He thought they might kill him. Demosthenes arrives. Says, Nick, let's do something. They tried valiantly. An attack on a hill fort that would have enabled them possibly to complete their walls. That would have starved the Syracusans into surrender. It fails. I got 5? Okay. That fails. I've got to worry about that bell. It fails. And now the question is, what are we going to do? Demosthenes goes up to Nick and says, Nick, let's get out of here. Let's just get out of here. Nicias looks at him. He's suffering. This drama, this is the most dramatic piece of writing about war in all of ancient literature. Now, these just books 5 and 6. They suck students in. Demosthenes, let's get out of here. We're going to get killed. We got a fleet. The Syracusans are manning their fleet day by day. They're getting stronger. We got to get while the getting's good. Nicias says, well, I'm not so sure. And he does it for a mixture of motives. Partly superstition. All right? Soothsayers say, you can't leave. You've got to wait a number of days. I think the main reason is Nicias says, look, if I go back home having ordered withdrawal from this fiasco on my own initiative, if I do that, the Athenians are going to kill me. That's not a metaphor. They're going to kill me. They'll take all my land. They'll give it to somebody else. My family will be starving. You can't do that. He says, I would rather die with honor in Sicily than die with dishonor in Athens. The only problem is that by waiting, he's going to take 40,000 other Athenians down with him for the sake of his own honor. That says something about his morals. Anyway, they wait. They try to escape by sea a number of times. They fail. They evacuate by land. The parts get cut off, harassed, surrounded. They're totally obliterated. Well, it raises some important questions. What have we done, or what have I tried to do? My son right now is taking a modern European history course. And at times he comes home, he's very frustrated for a variety of reasons. One is with what he's reading. He considers his history book an insult to his intelligence. And it is. I've seen it. The other reason is the teacher is so engaged in making sure everybody is on board, working through some version of the actuality of how events might have unfolded, that the eros, as the Greeks might say it, the thing that sucks you in and makes you want to learn it, the imagination, all right, the debates, they don't have time for it. Look, it takes a consummate professional to bore my son in history class. All right? You really got to work at it. And I'm saying that just as, you need aristocratic history to balance against democratic history, I think you really need students going through some version of critical analysis to keep that spark alive or to awaken it. I know maybe 50, 75, 80% of your time has to be devoted to getting everybody on board, moving in the right direction. But you need that 25, 15, even 10% where they're out there talking and debating. And little people that they might be, well, actually, they're not so little, younger people that they might be, the only way they grow up is when they engage in some version of critical analysis. All right, I think I should stop.
Thank you very much, Professor Walling. I think you've demonstrated well the objective of every lesson plan, as you stated, which is to create a rumble in the classroom, and that's exactly what you've done. Your method can be applied to any campaign or any war, and we thank you for that demonstration.